Cassandra Miller had never believed in the myth of starting over. Reinvention, in her opinion, was a polished fantasy peddled by people who mistook distance for clarity. You could change your address, repaint your walls, even grow new habits, but you were still you, with your old patterns and the same aching memory stitched into every corner of your mind. So when she bought the dusty, sloped property in Clearwater Glen, a neighborhood built around regulation and reputation, she wasn't chasing reinvention. She was simply trying to exist quietly within boundaries she could control. She needed a place that was hers, not in name, not in mortgage papers, but in feeling. A place where no one questioned her silences, her routines, or why she declined every invitation with the same smile. The house was unremarkable in the listing photos: single story, trimmed hedges, southern porch with chipped white railings, but Cassandra had seen something in the angle of the backyard fence, in the way the sun caught the stone path that wound toward a half-built patio. It wasn't charm, it was potential. She saw the blueprint of solitude. Within the first month, she had stripped the interior down to its bones, repainting walls with calming, mossy greens and replacing the cold, sterile kitchen tiles with warm terracotta that carried the earthy scent of desert air. She cleared out the tangled backyard and built a rectangular pool, not for leisure, but for work. As a former specialist in aquatic ecosystems, Cassandra had spent a decade researching waterborne plant structures before she resigned from the university, quietly, after a colleague took credit for one of her more controversial findings. That betrayal had taught her more about human ecosystems than scientific ones, and she had no interest in re-entering the hierarchy of grants, peer reviews, and department politics. Her backyard pool became a new kind of lab, one built not on prestige but on precision and personal stewardship. She grew rare floaters in controlled conditions, documented their adaptations, and submitted findings to private environmental journals under a pseudonym. It was her secret triumph, not meant to be shared or celebrated, just understood. To the neighbors, however, the pool was simply a pool. And that, she had realized too late, was the beginning of her problem. Clearwater Glen was the sort of place that prided itself on being community first. That phrase, stenciled onto the front page of the welcome packet she never read, sounded neighborly at first glance but carried the undercurrent of expectation. Fences here were low on purpose, invitations were persistent, and the idea of private space, especially large, clean, shimmering bodies of water, was a communal obsession. Cassandra had ignored the hints at first, passive comments about summer fun and neighborhood kids getting bored. Dropped casually during early morning walks, one woman's suggestion, said with a laugh, that Cassandra consider opening the space for weekly kids' swims. She had smiled politely, tucked the comment into the pile of social noise she never responded to, and kept her gate locked. And then Karen Boyd arrived. Technically, Karen had been living there for years, but Cassandra didn't meet her until one warm Sunday evening. A week after Cassandra held a private garden reception for a few colleagues from a local seed preservation group. The event had been quiet, tasteful, 3 people in linen shirts sipping herbal tea, discussing drought-resistant species and low-chlorine filtration systems. But it had drawn eyes. The next morning, Karen appeared at her gate like a figure summoned by ritual. Perfectly manicured, with her stiff posture and perfume that carried across the yard, Karen introduced herself with a voice that slid between greeting and evaluation. "I just wanted to say hello," she said, her smile wide, her eyes narrowed. "We don't get a lot of new residents who like to keep to themselves. Some of us were starting to wonder what you're doing back here with all that water." Cassandra raised an eyebrow, already sensing the temperature of the exchange. "I'm a private person. I keep to myself, that's true. But I take good care of my home." Karen's smile didn't falter, but something behind her teeth shifted. Of course, of course. And that pool, gorgeous. Just sits there sparkling. My grandkids would go wild. You know, they're staying with me this summer, and we've been meaning to ask." Cassandra didn't let her finish. "It's not for swimming. It's not built for children. It's a controlled system for aquatic plant research. I'm afraid it wouldn't be safe. The disappointment in Karen's face was instantaneous and instantly suppressed. Oh, she said softly, eyes darting toward the locked gate. Well, I suppose that's a shame. Still, in this neighborhood, we try to be generous. It's what builds trust. Cassandra nodded once. Boundaries also build trust. Karen laughed, a sharp bark of amusement that didn't match the summer air. Fair enough, just thought I'd ask. You'll see we're a tight-knit bunch here. Everyone shares. It's just how things are done. That phrase stuck with her. Not because of the words themselves, but the tone flat, clipped, definitive. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a rule. And Cassandra understood rules. She had spent her life abiding by them, bending to the demands of academia, peer politics, and now apparently residential customs. But what she never tolerated was coercion disguised as culture. She thanked Karen, stepped back into her garden, and bolted the gate behind her. That should have been the end. It wasn't. 3 days later, she woke to the sound of splashing. For one surreal second, she thought a bird had fallen into the pool. Then she heard laughter, high-pitched, shrill, joyful in the way only children can be when they believe they've found a loophole in the adult world. She walked outside to find 2 kids, soaking wet, dragging a neon pool float across the shallow end of the water. Karen sat on a chair nearby, holding a large insulated cup and texting, her legs crossed elegantly. Cassandra didn't shout. She didn't panic. She stood at the edge of the pool and said, in a calm voice that carried over the water, "You need to leave." Really? Karen looked up, startled though Cassandra couldn't tell if the surprise was genuine or performative. "Oh, Cassandra, I didn't think you'd be home. They just needed to cool off. It's such a hot day, and honestly, what's the harm?" "The harm," Cassandra replied, "is that you've trespassed. This is not a community pool. You entered my property without permission." Karen blinked, then stood, brushing invisible crumbs from her skirt. "You're being ridiculous. They're children. This is a neighborhood, not a fortress." Cassandra's voice didn't waver. "I'm asking you one last time. Or leave." Karen gathered her things with a level of theatrical indignation usually reserved for courtroom dramas and PTA meetings. "You'll regret being so cold," she said over her shoulder. "People talk, and around here, how you treat your neighbors matters." As they walked off her property, water dripping onto the carefully laid stones, Cassandra realized she wasn't angry. She was focused. What had begun as a quiet refusal had now escalated into a boundary violation. And if there was one thing she had learned from years of working in unpredictable ecosystems, it was that unchecked invasions, however small, they often signaled the beginning of something much larger and far harder to contain. She drained the pool that night, not out of spite, not out of fear, but to reclaim the space, reclaim the narrative, before it was rewritten without her consent. And that, she would come to understand, was the moment the real conflict began. The next morning, Cassandra woke to silence, a kind of deliberate stillness that settles not by chance, but by decision, like the neighborhood had conspired to mute itself. The usual chirping of distant sprinklers, the faint hum of lawnmowers starting up at dawn, even the barking of the Labrador across the street had ceased. She stepped onto her porch with a mug of black coffee, and though the view looked unchanged, something in the air had shifted. Her instincts, honed by years of observing fragile biological systems, were alert to these kinds of patterns. When living things stop behaving normally, it usually means they've sensed a threat. What Cassandra didn't yet know was that the neighborhood had, in its own quiet way, marked her. Not in confrontation, not in vandalism, at least not yet, but with something far more corrosive: collective rejection. Later that afternoon, as she trimmed the edges of her rosemary hedge, she noticed a group of neighbors gathered at the far end of the cul-de-sac, all of them facing inward like a flock shielding something. Their voices were low, occasionally punctuated by laughter or sharp nods, and though no one pointed, she could feel the slant of their glances. Karen was there, unmistakably centered, her hands gesturing as she spoke with slow, emphatic rhythm. The group eventually dispersed, each person returning to their homes with a purposeful gait, like soldiers leaving a morning briefing. No one made eye contact with Cassandra. No one waved. The shift from cold civility to visible exclusion was swift. Deliveries were left carelessly at the edge of her walkway. A nearby child threw a rock that accidentally chipped one of her ceramic garden markers. The local newsletter distributed in printed form, as if curated for the neighborhood's generational pride, began to arrive with pages missing or water damaged. She found her garbage bin overturned twice in 1 week, once with coffee grounds and wet leaves deliberately smeared across her driveway. These weren't accidents. They were signs, weak, cowardly signs, but signs nonetheless. She documented them all, quietly, diligently, photos, dates, times, everything tucked into a digital folder labeled Garden Watch. Still, none of it quite prepared her for what she found 2 days later. She had drained the pool as a form of reclamation, a silent reminder that the water, like everything else on her property, was hers to control. But in that choice, she had committed what the neighborhood saw as an unforgivable crime. She disrupted their illusion of access. The empty pool, covered now by a thick black vinyl tarp and secured at the edges, had become a canvas for resentment. She discovered it one morning in the sharp light of dawn. Scrawled across the center of the tarp, in white spray paint, were the words, "Water is for everyone." The lettering was crude, uneven, almost childlike in its urgency, but unmistakable in its message. This wasn't graffiti. This was doctrine. A declaration of values, just not hers. Cassandra stared at the message for a long moment, letting the coffee in her hand grow cold. She didn't feel rage or panic. What she felt was confirmation. The conflict had evolved. This was no longer about Karen or her grandkids, or a miscommunication about property lines. This was tribal now, and she had been cast as the threat. She filed a formal complaint not with the police, but with the management office overseeing the community's property maintenance and standards. She included photos, timestamps, and a neutral statement outlining the incident without accusation. It was an intentional choice. She knew that if she framed it as a neighborly dispute, it would be buried. But by categorizing it as a breach of visual harmony and property damage, she triggered the bureaucratic nerve of the office, which was far more motivated by aesthetics than justice. The reply came 2 days later, unsigned, terse, and utterly useless, unable to verify responsible party. Please refer to Section 8.3 regarding community disputes and private resolution recommendations. Cassandra didn't bother responding. Instead, she ordered a new tarp, this time industrial grade, fire-resistant, with a locking seal at the edges. She also installed 2 passive infrared motion sensors near the pool, connected to a silent alarm system that sent pings directly to her phone. She didn't plan to confront anyone, but she did plan to know. That weekend, while the rest of the cul-de-sac buzzed with trimmed hedges and polite car washes, Karen made her second official move. It arrived as a printed letter, folded once and slipped into her mailbox, not in an envelope, but loose, as if casualness made it less aggressive. It wasn't a notice or a legal warning. It was a statement of principles, typed in an overly formal serif font that tried to disguise its hostility as decorum. It read, "To whom it may concern. It has come to the attention of several residents that the atmosphere of our once cohesive street has changed significantly since the addition of new ownership at 418 Clearwater. While we all believe in the right to personal property and peaceful living, there is a growing concern regarding the lack of communal consideration and an unwillingness to engage in shared values. Your decision to isolate your amenities and deny access, particularly to children in need of recreation, has been noted as inconsistent with the spirit of this neighborhood. We respectfully encourage reconsideration, as continued exclusivity may prompt further review by relevant parties. Respectfully, your neighbors." There was no name, no signature, no stamp, Just your neighbors. Cassandra read it once, then again. She didn't need a law degree to understand what it implied. This wasn't a plea. It was a soft threat, a warning veiled in civility. And she had seen enough field behavior in mammals to recognize when a pack began to encircle what it viewed as an outlier. The next day, she found the gate to her backyard slightly ajar. Not broken, not forced. Just unlatched. It had been locked the night before. She checked the latch, no damage. The padlock was still functional, but the chain was looped differently, as if removed and replaced by unfamiliar hands. It was a whisper of intrusion, not enough to prove, not enough to accuse, but enough to feel. She changed the lock and added a secondary internal catch. By midweek, her motion sensor pinged 3 separate times during the early morning hours. No figures on the cameras, no real movement visible, just a flicker of change in the corner of the frame, like a shadow where no person stood. She began to sleep in lighter cycles, waking at the smallest creak. She took no action, made no report, but every morning she documented the sensor logs with time and temperature. Pattern recognition, she told herself, was everything. Karen, meanwhile, had escalated her campaign publicly. During a walk through the neighborhood's central green space, Cassandra overheard her speaking animatedly to a small cluster of residents seated on wrought iron benches. "It's about trust," Karen was saying. "When one person acts like their land is a fortress, the rest of us feel like we're living next to a stranger. How long before that becomes dangerous?" No one challenged her. A few nodded. One older man muttered something about selfishness dressed as privacy. Cassandra didn't interrupt. She simply walked past them without acknowledgement, keeping her expression neutral. It wasn't her job to defend herself to people who had already chosen a side. And in any case, she knew the timeline they were building: isolation, accusation, escalation. It was a slow bleed, a long game. But what Karen didn't know was that Cassandra wasn't playing defense. Not anymore. She was observing. And when the time came, she would act not with noise, not with confrontation, but with precision. Because in every natural system, there's a moment when balance tips. And once it does, it doesn't reset. It breaks. That moment was coming. And Cassandra was already preparing for it. By the start of the 3rd week, Cassandra had accepted that nothing about her quiet relocation to Clearwater Glen would proceed without resistance. The pool had become a symbol, its surface once glassy and reflective, now covered and protected, and in doing so, had drawn a fault line through the neighborhood. What she didn't anticipate was how swiftly symbolic resistance would morph into systemic harassment, layered not in criminality but in careful, deniable inconvenience. It started subtly, with her trash collection inexplicably delayed 3 weeks in a row, despite every other bin on the street being picked up promptly each Tuesday. When she called municipal services, the representative politely informed her that her address had been temporarily flagged for verification, a vague administrative term that meant nothing and couldn't be traced to a formal report. Her mail began arriving open, just enough of a tear in the envelopes to suggest mishandling, but not enough to warrant a postal claim. Deliveries were redirected or marked undeliverable, despite correct labeling. The cumulative effect wasn't devastation. It was erosion. And Cassandra, methodical by nature and now sharpened by suspicion, documented each instance without exception. The day the anonymous flyer appeared was unseasonably warm. Cassandra had been in the front garden inspecting new mulch when she saw the folded half-sheet fluttering on her welcome mat. Its design was simple, clip art level, the kind of graphic horror born from suburban software, bold red font reading, "Does she belong here?" Above a cropped, low-resolution photo of Cassandra walking to her mailbox, printed in grainy grayscale. Below, bullet points listed out of context: allegations, refuses neighborhood unity, files excessive complaints, deliberately withholds shared resources, as if civility were a resource to ration, and she had hoarded it. It didn't include a name or contact info, only the phrase "ask around." "You deserve to know." Cassandra stood holding the flyer for a long time, unmoving, until a breeze lifted the corner. That small motion grounded her. She walked inside, placed the flyer into a clear plastic document protector, and filed it under harassment indirect. She didn't call the police. She knew the limits of enforcement, the soft wall of not criminal that people like Karen navigated expertly. Cassandra wasn't interested in yelling into a phone. She was interested in timing, accuracy, and building an undeniable chain of proof. Later that week, a small group of children appeared in front of her house. They didn't step onto her lawn. Instead, they stood precisely at the edge of the sidewalk, kicking a deflated ball between them, loud enough to be heard from inside. One child, blonde, probably 7 or 8, kept glancing at her front window before shouting, "Is it true she hates kids?" Another chimed in, "My grandma says she's dangerous." Cassandra didn't move. She watched from the hallway, unseen. The performance lasted 10 minutes. Then they scattered like birds at a sudden sound. Later she checked her mailbox. Inside, rolled tightly, was a printed notice from the Neighborhood Preservation Committee, a vaguely titled group she'd never heard of. The letter claimed she was in violation of communal appearance standards and included a blurry image of the tarp-covered pool with a caption that read, "Unneighborly visual obstruction." The notice carried no legal weight, but its phrasing was clever, designed to mimic official correspondence. She scanned the letter, added it to the growing file, and made no outward sign of reaction. The next escalation came through bureaucratic theater. 2 weeks after the pool had been covered and drained, a man arrived at Cassandra's door wearing khakis, a polo with an embroidered logo she didn't recognize, and a laminated badge hanging around his neck. He introduced himself as Greg and said he was there on behalf of a property oversight initiative contracted by the city. Cassandra asked to see credentials. The badge had no surname, no ID number, and the company name listed was one she couldn't verify online. Greg smiled too widely. Nothing to worry about, just a routine perimeter review for upcoming zoning updates. We're making sure all pool areas are compliant with the new 2024 safety visibility standards. Cassandra said nothing, holding the doorframe like a boarder. You're welcome to send that request in writing. I won't authorize entry without documentation. Greg's smile thinned. We'll be back, he said, voice suddenly flatter. Things are changing around here. She watched him walk to a black SUV idling at the curb. Inside, she saw Karen in the passenger seat, her sunglasses reflecting the front of Cassandra's house. Cassandra didn't sleep that night. Not from fear, but from acceleration. Everything was moving faster now. It was no longer about petty irritation. It was a coordinated narrative war, Cassandra as the villain, the recluse, the anti-neighbor. She realized the mistake many people in her position made was assuming the strength of silence. But silence, in the face of calculated rumor and performance, becomes complicit. And so Cassandra acted not with confrontation, but with precision. She contacted a regional property law firm, specifically requesting counsel experienced in neighborhood intimidation and soft zoning manipulation. Within a week, she had a retained attorney named Lauren Trask, a quietly intense woman with a background in municipal code enforcement and a zero-tolerance policy for informal power structures. Lauren reviewed Cassandra's file, listened in full silence, then asked one question, "Do you want to win, or just survive?" "I want to make it stop," Cassandra said. "Then you'll need to hold the line and keep your records airtight. No improvisation, no reaction. We move only through official channels." From that point forward, Cassandra did exactly that. Any letters were sent certified. Any requests for property access were required to go through Lauren's office. A cease and desist was issued to the Neighborhood Preservation Committee, requesting verification of legitimacy and formal dissolution if none was found. Cassandra began to receive notices that complaints against her were being reviewed. The tone of the neighborhood changed again, less direct, more simmering. The children stopped playing in front of her house. Flyers no longer appeared, but Karen escalated, as expected. One morning, Cassandra found her irrigation system disabled. A technician confirmed it had been deliberately tampered with, filters removed, tubing sliced near the main valve. Repairs would cost over $1,000. She submitted the invoice to Lauren, who began the process of tracing local service logs and filed an incident report with the management office, citing sabotage. No one responded. That evening, a neighbor walked past her house and muttered, "This is what happens when you fight everyone." It was meant to intimidate. It didn't. Cassandra simply added it to the log. The final moment of the week, however, was unexpected in its boldness. A folded sheet of paper, taped to her front door with clear packing tape, no envelope, just ink on white. A single sentence, printed in block letters. "If you shut yourself off from us, don't be surprised when we seal you in." Cassandra stared at the paper for a long time, then removed it without ceremony, folded it, and placed it under the same category as the flyer, implied threats, non-actionable. She didn't notify the authorities. She notified her lawyer. Because what Karen and the others hadn't understood, what they would soon learn, was that Cassandra didn't believe in escalation for the sake of reaction. She believed in patterns, and she knew exactly when to break them. Cassandra had never considered herself someone who needed allies. For most of her life, independence had been both armor and identity, something honed by academic solitude and years of navigating institutional politics without falling into the trap of campus camaraderie. She preferred results to recognition and solitude over support. But after a month in Clearwater Glen, she began to understand that in certain ecosystems, survival wasn't determined by intelligence or strategy alone. It required leverage. And leverage sometimes came in the form of witnesses. The turning point arrived on a Thursday morning, quiet and windless, when she received an unexpected phone call from Lauren, her lawyer. Lauren, never one for pleasantries, skipped any greeting and went straight into the matter. "We've been contacted by an outside party. Someone left a message with our office asking to speak off the record regarding your situation. I'm sending you a recording. I want you to listen to it before I call them back." Cassandra opened the secure file and played the message twice, listening not just to the words but to the tone. The voice belonged to a man, older, careful with his phrasing but not cautious in a fearful way, more like someone used to being ignored and choosing, finally, to speak anyway. He identified himself only as Mark from 2 streets over and claimed to have lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. In his brief message, he explained that what was happening to Cassandra was not new. Different in tone, perhaps, more concentrated, but not unprecedented. He mentioned a couple named the Darnells who had moved out abruptly 3 years prior, and a quiet widow who left after too many accidents. He offered no proof, only the promise that he'd seen the same patterns before, and that if Cassandra wanted to understand the scope of it, he could help. Lauren's instructions were clear: you don't meet with him. Not yet. Let me verify his identity and background first. If he's legitimate, he could help us build context for a harassment claim, especially if there's a precedent of coordinated community pressure. But don't assume anything yet. We vet before we trust. Cassandra agreed, but privately she already believed him. That same day, she received a notice from the county's residential compliance department. It was a formal letter with a barcode and signature, not the fabricated documents Karen had been circulating. The letter cited a complaint filed by multiple residents regarding a possible unauthorized water feature that no longer served a functional or aesthetic purpose. In short, they were attempting to classify her drain pool as a non-compliant structure. The claim didn't come from the HOA or its usual channels. It came through a county submission portal. That meant someone had taken their campaign to a governmental level. The strategy had shifted. Lauren reviewed the letter and responded with a 5-page brief citing property rights, zoning history, and records of the permitted construction. She included architectural drawings, original blueprints, and a detailed breakdown of the pool's filtration system. The response was clinical, impenetrable to non-experts, and more importantly triggered an official review that stalled any action for 60 days. It bought them time. While the complaint hung in limbo, Cassandra received word from Lauren that Mark had been verified. He was, in fact, a long-term resident, a retired building inspector, and the Darnells whom he'd mentioned had left the community after facing a similarly subtle, yet intense, campaign of disapproval that began with gossip and ended in fabricated zoning violations. Cassandra agreed to a phone call. The conversation with Mark was quiet, sobering, and oddly gentle. He didn't come off as bitter or vengeful. Instead, he sounded tired, as though watching another version of the same story unfold had worn down whatever faith he had left in people's ability to live decently beside each other. He spoke of Karen with something close to resignation. She doesn't need a reason. She needs momentum. Once she senses an opening, someone too smart, too private, too unwilling to perform, she treats it like an infection that needs to be burned out. And she doesn't act alone. That's her genius. She plants the seed and lets others water it. Cassandra asked why he stayed if he knew what kind of community this was. His answer came without hesitation. Because I've learned how to disappear. You haven't. And now they're trying to erase you. The call ended with no promise of further contact, just a shared understanding that Cassandra now had perspective context that went beyond her own experience. It didn't make her feel safer, but it did make her feel less alone. That weekend, someone carved into her back fence. It wasn't deep, not enough to splinter or structurally damage the wood, but the message was unmistakable, a single word, ragged and uneven parasite. Cassandra didn't call the police. She called a contractor to replace the panel. She took photos, cataloged the evidence, and forwarded it to Lauren. But internally, something had shifted. Until now, she had responded defensively controlled, methodical, reactive. But she understood now that control without confrontation only emboldened those who operated in suggestion and implication. Karen wasn't just pressuring her. She was engineering a narrative that painted Cassandra as something outside the collective order, antisocial, elitist, dangerous. And that narrative needed to be shattered. On Monday, Cassandra filed her own complaint. Not to the HOA, not through Lauren, but directly to the county clerk's office under the Civil Harm Ordinance for targeted harassment. It was an obscure filing pathway, rarely used by private residents, but entirely legal. It allowed for a pre-investigative inquiry into pattern-based intimidation. It wasn't a lawsuit, but it was the opening move of one. Within 72 hours, the management office received a request for records of all neighborhood complaints, citations, and filed grievances involving Cassandra's property. Karen would know, and more importantly, so would the others. For the first time since the conflict had begun, Cassandra went out into her yard and removed the black vinyl cover from the drained pool. She didn't refill it. She didn't open it to the public. She simply let it sit there in empty space, deliberate and unapologetic, framed by thriving plants and clean lines. It wasn't meant to be an olive branch. It was a statement of ownership. That evening, Karen passed her on the sidewalk. She didn't speak. She didn't sneer. But she didn't look away either. Something had changed. The neighborhood was no longer circling her. It was watching. And Cassandra intended to give them something worth watching. The moment Cassandra filed the harassment notice with the county clerk, a subtle but unmistakable shift rippled through the neighborhood. It was as though the machinery behind the hostility previously masked by smiles, excuses, and bureaucratic misdirection lurched forward, no longer interested in maintaining the illusion of misunderstanding. She noticed it first in the timing. Within 48 hours, 3 different utility service providers arrived unannounced at her property, each claiming to be following up on recent complaints. The water inspector checked her irrigation system for excessive flow, despite the system having been professionally replaced just weeks earlier. The power company technician cited an anonymous report of unauthorized wiring near her back porch, which turned out to be the solar lights she'd installed herself, according to manufacturer guidelines. And the third, a man from sanitation stood awkwardly at her front gate, reading from a clipboard as he explained someone had logged her property as a site of persistent organic waste accumulation, which, when pressed for specifics, turned out to mean a compost bin. None of the visits resulted in violations or formal write-ups, but the effect was cumulative. It was no longer passive hostility. It was a campaign, strategic, multi-pronged, engineered to wear her down by proxy through systems that, on the surface, appeared to be functioning normally. And Cassandra, for all her composure, could feel the pulse of it in her teeth. She maintained her posture, answered every inspector with calm precision, documented each exchange, and sent a summary to Lauren at the end of every day. They both understood the tactic. Flood the subject with friction, force mistakes, then use those mistakes to justify further pressure. It was standard practice in soft displacement campaigns, especially in wealthier communities where legal eviction was difficult and public pressure was the preferred instrument of expulsion. What made it worse was the quiet. No more direct attacks. No spray paint. No threatening notes. Just process forms, visits, whispers, all sanitized by plausible deniability. The neighborhood had moved from character assassination to institutional pressure, and Cassandra knew the next step would be the most dangerous: isolation through escalation. It arrived in the form of a petition. Not a legal one, but a social maneuver disguised as democratic engagement. The document appeared folded on her porch, printed on cream-colored stock with a decorative header that read Community Standards Preservation Initiative. Beneath it, a list of bullet points outlining proposed modifications to the community's guidelines, each one tailored with surgical precision to target her property without naming it directly. Water features must be filled or dismantled within 30 days of deactivation. All fences must maintain a uniform visual profile. Non-participatory lots may be subject to re-evaluation under Section 4.9. The final point, bolded for emphasis, homeowners who consistently reject neighborhood engagement may be deemed disruptive under collective consensus. 42 signatures followed, including names she recognized, neighbors who had once waved politely, made small talk, complimented her garden. Their betrayal didn't surprise her, but it confirmed a truth she'd suspected for weeks. Karen had shifted tactics again. This was no longer about the pool. It was about Cassandra herself, her presence, her refusal to conform, her unwillingness to play by the unwritten rules of suburban diplomacy. She had become an infection in their system, and the petition was their immune response. She sent the document to Lauren, who immediately began preparing a response with constitutional language around property rights and community bylaws. But Cassandra knew the legal counterstrike would take time. What mattered now was perception, and Karen knew it. The next evening, Cassandra returned home from a meeting with Lauren to find her front yard occupied. Not by protesters, not by vandals, but by the illusion of a celebration. Folding tables had been set up on the sidewalk. Streamers and balloons stretched between lampposts. Children ran laughing between chairs, and adults sipped from plastic cups, talking in tones just loud enough to carry. A large sign was taped to the hedge bordering her yard. It read, "Neighborhood Unity Night, everyone welcome." The message was obvious. The line had been drawn. Cassandra's home was no longer part of the neighborhood. It had become the backdrop to their rejection. She stood for a moment, keys in hand, surveying the crowd. No one approached. No one acknowledged her presence. It was as if she were invisible. But the laughter was louder than it needed to be. The glances sharper than coincidence allowed. Karen stood near the drinks table, wearing a sundress and holding court, laughing at something a man had just said. Her eyes flicking to Cassandra only once, long enough to register victory, short enough to avoid confrontation. Cassandra walked inside, locked the door, and turned off the lights. Not out of fear. Out of calculation. She would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. That night, she wrote a detailed account of the gathering, recorded timestamps, and added the photos she took from her upstairs window. She wasn't preparing a counterattack. She was building a record, one that no amount of suburban theater could overwrite. 2 days later, the incident escalated from symbolic to material. Cassandra woke to find her backyard gate wide open and 3 of her aquaponic plant beds torn apart. The trays were smashed, the netting shredded. One of the filtration tanks had been cracked along the base, leaking slowly into the soil. There were no footprints, no debris, nothing left behind, just destruction, calculated and contained. Not random vandalism. Not kids. Someone who knew what to damage without making it look like a crime. She didn't call the police. She called a private security consultant recommended by Lauren, someone who specialized in quiet residential surveillance. Within 72 hours, 4 new cameras were installed around the perimeter of her house, discreet but comprehensive. Their feeds were routed through an encrypted server Lauren could access at any time. Cassandra said nothing to the neighborhood. She simply replaced the damaged beds and moved her remaining plants inside, sealing the greenhouse with a coded lock. Then Karen made a mistake. For weeks she had relied on implication and maneuvering. But confidence, Cassandra had learned, often leads people to overreach. That Sunday, a neighborhood newsletter arrived. It was printed professionally, bound with a plastic spine, and distributed to every house on the street. Inside, under the section labeled Resident Spotlight, was a paragraph that recounted recent challenges with communal participation and highlighted one particular resident whose refusal to integrate has led to disruption and legal proceedings. Though her name wasn't printed, the details were unmistakable. It referenced a former professor who had installed research equipment under the guise of garden decor, and described her pool as a weaponized status symbol masquerading as science. It accused her of emotional endangerment through isolationism and concluded with a rallying cry, "We must decide if Clearwater Glen is a community or a collection of fences." Lauren acted within the hour. A cease and desist was issued for defamation, citing not only libel but targeted psychological harassment. A formal letter was sent to the publishing office and the neighborhood's legal representative. And Cassandra, now pushed past the threshold of patience, filed for a temporary injunction against further community action targeting her property. The filing triggered an administrative hold on all active neighborhood petitions. Karen responded by organizing a town meeting informal, unsanctioned, but crowded. According to Mark, who quietly observed from a distance, the meeting devolved quickly into complaint sharing, conspiracy, and paranoid speculation. Cassandra was accused of being part of a research firm collecting data without consent. One resident even suggested she was recording the neighborhood to expose them online. It was the logic of desperation, of a group that had built a story too elaborate to admit it was ever fiction. By the end of the month, 2 things were clear. First, Cassandra wasn't leaving. And second, the neighborhood had turned from unified force into scattered resentment. The pressure campaign had lost momentum, and now Karen's actions were drawing attention unwanted, official, and potentially damaging. Cassandra had not shouted. She had not accused. She had recorded, responded, and restrained herself with the precision of someone who understood systems, not just biological ones, but human ones. She hadn't resisted the neighborhood's attack. She had absorbed it, documented it, turned it into a case file. And the case was nearly ready. Soon, it would no longer be a story told through glances and flyers. Soon, it would be a matter of record. And when that day came, Cassandra wouldn't ask for justice. She would require it. Cassandra had always believed that conflict, when prolonged beyond logic, eventually collapses under its own weight. What begins as grievance grows into obsession, and obsession demands escalation not for resolution, but for vindication. Karen, for all her composure and cultivated demeanor, had passed that threshold long ago. And Cassandra knew the moment was coming when a misstep would no longer be a matter of community irritation, but of law. That moment arrived not with noise, but with a signature. One morning, as Cassandra walked out to collect her mail, she found a certified envelope tucked inside her box, issued not from a government agency, but from the neighborhood management office. It contained a formal citation alleging that she had failed to comply with an active compliance remediation request, a phrase that sounded legal but had no basis in county code. It referred vaguely to an unauthorized private structure, citing the drain pool and her converted greenhouse as non-conforming developments. The citation threatened fines, followed by compulsory mediation, and finally potential lien placement on the property if the issue remained unresolved. Cassandra stood in the driveway, holding the letter like a dried leaf, brittle and absurd. They had crossed the final boundary. What had begun with gossip and door-to-door whisper campaigns was now an attempt to force her into submission through fabricated bureaucratic power. But Cassandra had already prepared. The records she and Lauren had compiled over the past weeks documented inspections, compliance certificates, communications with city zoning officers provided airtight proof that the claims were baseless. Lauren immediately drafted a formal response, citing 3 separate county statutes that invalidated the citation and included a demand for immediate withdrawal under threat of legal counteraction. But this time Cassandra added her own paragraph measured, precise, and signed with her full name requesting a public retraction, the distribution of the corrected notice to all households, and a formal written apology from the management office. The move was bold, and Cassandra knew it. But it was also calculated. Karen had built her power on fear, ambiguity, and the illusion of procedural superiority. Cassandra had stripped all 3 away, and in doing so, triggered the inevitable public collapse. The following weekend, an emergency meeting was announced, not through official channels, but via a rush of printed flyers taped to mailboxes and shoved under doors. It was to be held at the Community Pavilion, an open-air structure near the entrance to Clearwater Glen, and was framed as a forum to clarify concerns and restore cohesion. Cassandra did not attend. Lauren did, however, as her authorized representative, armed with a folder of printed materials, audio recordings, and a formal letter addressed to the board. According to Lauren's report, the meeting devolved within the first 10 minutes. Karen began with a speech, positioning herself as a protector of neighborhood values, but the moment she referenced Cassandra by name, Lauren stood, calmly distributed the printed timeline of harassment events, and read aloud the county's dismissal of the false citation. She ended with a direct warning: further actions of this kind will not be tolerated. You are now being watched not only by your neighbors, but by legal counsel with authority to act on our client's behalf. The silence that followed was, by Lauren's account, suffocating. But Karen was not finished. That night, Cassandra's surveillance system captured footage of a figure entering her backyard unrecognizable in the dark, face obscured by a hood, but unmistakably intentional. The person approached the pool, stood at its edge for nearly 3 minutes, and then turned sharply toward the greenhouse before disappearing behind the tall hedge at the back of the lot. The next morning, Cassandra found the coded lock to her greenhouse damaged, scratched, twisted, but not broken. Nothing inside was touched. But it was enough to convert implication into action. Lauren filed a report with the local sheriff's department, accompanied by the video footage and the ongoing record of documented harassment. A formal investigation was opened. For the first time since moving into Clearwater Glen, law enforcement was now involved not as a passive presence, but as an active entity. Karen, by pushing beyond the veil of neighborhood concern, had summoned exactly what she had tried so hard to avoid outside scrutiny. 3 days later, 2 officers arrived at Karen's home, not in sirens or show, but quietly, stepping into the house with clipboards and calm expressions. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains and parked cars. Karen did not come out. Rumors spread quickly. Some said she'd been warned, others that she was under review by the board. But Cassandra didn't listen. She focused on the facts. And the fact was, the silence that followed the investigation was different than before. Not hostile, not cold, just quiet. The flyers stopped. The anonymous notes ceased. No more inspectors arrived. The petition was rescinded without explanation. And one afternoon, a man from sanitation returned to her property, apologized for the earlier confusion, and confirmed her address had been re-verified and cleared. No explanation, just correction. But Cassandra knew better than to celebrate. The end of visible hostility was not peace. It was repositioning. Karen had not disappeared. She had simply been forced into retreat. And Cassandra, standing by her greenhouse, staring at the lock she'd now replaced with reinforced hardware, knew the real victory wasn't in the silence. It was in the system. For every whisper Karen had crafted, Cassandra had answered with evidence. For every pressure tactic, she had responded with structure. The pool remained empty not as a statement of defeat, but as a monument to resistance. Not angry, not loud, just there, still and unapologetic. A controlled environment, perfectly contained. Like her, Clearwater Glen had tried to absorb her. When that failed, it tried to erase her. But Cassandra had done what few people in such neighborhoods ever manage. She didn't win with violence. She didn't flee. She remained. Intact, unchanged, unbent. The cul-de-sac would never be the same again, and neither would Karen. The transformation of Clearwater Glen did not arrive with declarations or banners or dramatic upheaval. It unfolded quietly, like fog receding at dawn, slow, steady, irreversible. In the weeks following the formal investigation and the withdrawal of every false citation, the neighborhood recalibrated not out of remorse or enlightenment, but out of necessity. The same mouths that once whispered accusations against Cassandra now practiced silence with careful discipline. The lawn gossip dried up. The pointed glances faded into neutral expressions. No apologies were offered, and Cassandra never expected them. She understood these people now. Their sense of community was not based on shared values or mutual respect. It was based on compliance, on submission, on a delicate performance of unity that only worked when everyone played along. Cassandra had refused the role, and in doing so, had dismantled the script they all relied on. Karen Boyd did not return to her former stature. After the visit from the sheriff's department, she withdrew from public visibility. The yard that once hosted summer barbecues and wine-soaked story circles became dormant. The floral wreaths on her front door vanished. The chairs on her porch were never touched. Over time, Karen's presence faded from the rhythm of the neighborhood like a name no one wanted to say aloud. It was Mark, the quiet observer from 2 streets over, who informed Cassandra that Karen had submitted her resignation from the advisory committee and declined to renew her community engagement status. She had not been exiled. She had retreated, a queen in self-imposed exile, unable to command but unwilling to surrender publicly. Her influence evaporated, and with it the architecture of intimidation she had spent years perfecting. Cassandra made no announcement, hosted no celebration. Her victory was structural, not social. She refilled the pool not to swim, not to entertain, but to restore equilibrium. The aquatic plants returned, anchored and steady, thriving under her care. The greenhouse, now reinforced and secured, became a space of quiet study again, unbothered, untouched. The cameras remained, not out of fear, but as a reminder that surveillance, when used wisely, is not about power, it is about memory. And Cassandra remembered everything. The names, the letters, the faces that turned away when she needed acknowledgement. She carried no vengeance, but she carried clarity. And that, she knew, was more dangerous than rage. Lauren eventually closed the case file, the last formal letter arriving in a slim envelope with her signature and a short note, "There is nothing further to pursue. You're clear. But if they ever come knocking again, you won't be answering the door alone." Cassandra kept the note, pressed between the pages of a field journal. Not for sentiment. For record. The neighborhood's management company, now under pressure from the county's compliance board, quietly revised its dispute procedures. All complaints were henceforth required to be submitted with verified signatures and traceable sources. The change was small, almost cosmetic. But Cassandra recognized it for what it was, a shift in ecosystem behavior. When a dominant force is exposed, the system adapts. She never joined a committee. She never attended a gathering. And yet she became part of the landscape not as a participant, but as a presence. A known, immovable constant. Some began to nod when passing her gate. Others waved. It was not affection. It was respect. Or something close to fear, which in communities like Clearwater Glen often looked the same. One afternoon, months later, Cassandra stood at the edge of the pool, watching the water ripple under a warm breeze. The sunlight traced gentle patterns on the surface, the reflections shifting like quiet language. She had considered moving, briefly, during the height of it all, selling the house, walking away, beginning again somewhere further from surveillance disguised as neighborliness. But now the idea seemed absurd. She had paid her cost, earned her ground. This place, once a trap of polite tyranny, had been reshaped not into a paradise, not into some romantic symbol of justice, but into something she could live with. Something she had made honest through persistence. Clearwater Glen had not changed because it wanted to. It changed because she didn't leave. And Cassandra had no intention of leaving. Not now. Not ever.